Clara Whitmore walked out of that saloon with nothing but a carpet bag, $2, and a name the whole town had already decided to bury. She didn't cry. She'd used up every last tear years ago. She just stood there in the summer heat in the middle of Red Hollow's main street, while people she'd served and smiled at for 3 years walked past her like she was already gone. If this story about a woman this town tried to erase speaks to something in your heart, subscribe to this channel. Follow Clara's story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The bag hit the dirt first. Clara didn't throw it. Her fingers just gave out 3 years of gripping, holding on, surviving, and her hands finally quit on her in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The carpet bag landed in the red dust of Red Hollow's main street and sat there like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't written herself. She stared at it. Then she picked it up. Because that was what Clara Whitmore did. She picked things up. She had been picking things up since she was 14 years old, and the world started throwing everything it had directly at her face. The summer of 1887 in Arizona Territory was the kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, it got inside your chest and squeezed. The air smelled like baked clay and horse leather, and the particular sharpness of a town that worked hard and forgave nothing. Red Hollow had maybe 400 souls, a courthouse with a cracked front step, 2 competing churches that hated each other more than they hated sin, and a saloon called the Golden Spur that had just been boarded up by order of the territorial marshal's office. The Golden Spur, where Clara had worked for 3 years. The Golden Spur, which was now officially evidence in a criminal case against its owner, a man named Gerald Hatch, who had been using the backroom ledgers to run land fraud on half the county. Clara had not known about the fraud. She had known about a lot of things, the way certain men talked too loud after their 3rd whiskey, the way the sheriff looked the other way when Hatch's name came up in conversation, the way money moved through that place in ways that didn't quite add up to honest arithmetic. But the land fraud itself, the forged deeds, the falsified surveys, the payments made to county officials, she had not known those specific facts. It didn't matter. She worked there, that was enough. The door to the Golden Spur had a new padlock on it put there that morning by a deputy with ink-stained fingers, and an expression like he was personally offended by Clara's existence. He hadn't spoken to her. He hadn't needed to. The padlock spoke clearly enough. No job. No wages for the last 2 weeks. Hatch had been arrested before payroll. No character reference from an establishment now classified as a criminal enterprise. Nothing but the carpet bag, the $2, and the name. She stood outside the padlocked door for a while. Not because she didn't know what to do. She was 31 years old, and she had always known what to do, had always had a plan, always kept moving. She stood there because for one long suspended minute, she needed to feel the full weight of it before she picked herself up and started walking again. The weight was considerable. 3 years. 3 years of being on her feet 10 hours a day, of smiling at men who looked at her like she was furniture, of saving every dollar she didn't need for food, of telling herself this was temporary. This was a stepping stone. This was not who she was, but simply what she was doing right now until something else opened up. 3 years of being careful. Of being smart, of not making enemies, not drawing attention, not causing trouble. And here she was. Same dirt, same heat, same Red Hollow that had never wanted her to begin with. She picked up the bag and started walking. She tried the mercantile first. Harold Greer ran the mercantile. He was 62 years old, had a wife named Bessie, who made excellent pie, and had bought coffee from Clara's serving tray no fewer than 40 times. He knew her name. He'd once, in a moment of unexpected decency, told her she had a quick mind. Clara walked into the mercantile, and Harold Greer looked up from behind his counter, and something moved across his face. Recognition, then calculation, then something that wasn't quite shame, but was in the neighborhood of it. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Greer, I'm looking for work. Anything you need, stocking shelves, keeping accounts, sweeping out. I'm reliable, I'm honest, and I know numbers." He looked at her for a long moment. The mercantile was empty, except for them. "I appreciate you coming in," he said, which was not yes. "I'm good with customers," Clara said. "You know that." "I do know that." He looked down at the counter. picked up a cloth and wiped a spot that didn't need wiping. "Clara, I'm going to be straight with you." "I wish you would." "The Hatch situation is all over town. People are talking. I've got a family business, a reputation." "I didn't do anything wrong. I know that." He said it quietly, and she almost believed he meant it. But knowing something and acting on it are two different things when you've got a wife and a business and people watching. So that's a no. "I'm sorry." She nodded. She did not thank him for his honesty because honesty that cost nothing wasn't worth gratitude. She tried the hotel next. The woman behind the desk, Mrs. Paulson, didn't even let Clara finish the sentence. "We run a respectable establishment." "I'm aware of that. I'm asking about laundry work, or—" "I said we run a respectable establishment." The seamstress on Calhoun Street had a notice in her window about needing help with alterations. When Clara walked in, the seamstress, a sharp-featured woman named Ellen Briggs, looked her up and down once and said, "That position's been filled." The notice was still in the window. Clara walked back out onto the street. She had $14 left in her room at the boarding house. A room she could keep for exactly 2 more weeks at current rates, and that was only if she didn't eat very much. She had the carpet bag and the $2 in her pocket, and a list of skills that apparently meant nothing the moment a padlock went on the wrong door. She sat down on the bench outside the post office, which was the one place in Red Hollow where sitting didn't carry a social statement because everyone sat there waiting for letters that were mostly bad news anyway. She was thinking about the next town. Tucson, maybe. Tombstone, though Tombstone had its own considerable reputation for eating people alive. Phoenix was growing. Phoenix might need bodies willing to work. She was calculating the cost of a stage ticket versus the distance she could cover on foot. She had walked long distances before she could do it again when she heard the sound of a horse. Not the usual clatter of Main Street traffic. Something different. A single horse moving at a particular pace. Deliberate. Like the rider was in no hurry, and also could not be stopped. She looked up. The man riding in from the north end of town was not from Red Hollow. She knew Red Hollow's horses and Red Hollow's riders the way you knew the furniture in a room you'd lived in for years. This horse was a dark bay with a mountain man's saddle, the kind with extra rigging for rough terrain leather, scarred by altitude and weather, in ways that flatland riding didn't produce. The rider matched the horse. He was tall in the saddle in a way that wasn't posture, but simply bone structure. The kind of height that came from long legs and a spine that had never learned to fold itself small. He wore a duster that had been gray once and was now the color of old ash. The hat was battered in all the right places. The badge on his chest caught the afternoon light just once, just a flash, and then the duster fell back over it. He rode like the landscape was something he had an agreement with rather than something he was passing through. Deputy Marshal Ethan Calloway. Clara didn't know his name yet. She would learn it within the hour. But she knew what he was before she knew who he was, the way you can sometimes read a person's whole character in 30 seconds of watching them move before they've opened their mouth or given you any reason to form an opinion. He was looking at the golden spur as he rode past it, taking in the padlock, the boarded side window, the general official abandonment of the place. His expression didn't change. He was cataloging, not reacting. Then his eyes moved across the street, and they landed on Clara. It was not the way men usually looked at her. She had extensive experience with the ways men looked at her, with appetite, with dismissal, with the particular combination of both that saloon work produced. This was none of those things. This was the look of a man who had learned somewhere, and at considerable cost, to see people accurately before he saw them as anything else. He took in the carpet bag, the bench, the particular stillness of a person making calculations in their head. He didn't say anything. He kept riding slow and steady toward the marshal's office at the end of the street. Clara watched him go and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not hope exactly. She'd burned through most of her hope before she turned 25. Something more guarded than hope, but structured similarly. Like the memory of hope, carrying the same shape. She told herself to stop being foolish and went back to calculating stage ticket prices. She found out his name from old Pete Dawson, who sat outside the marshal's office every afternoon, on account of having nowhere else to be and considerable opinions about everything that moved through town. "Ethan Calloway," Pete said when Clara asked. "Deputy Territorial Marshal out of Prescott. They sent him down on account of the hatch business. There's more to it than just the saloon, they're saying. Land fraud going back 6-7 years. He been here before. Once, 2 years back. Different business." Pete squinted at her. "You got dealings with him?" "No," Clara said. "Just asking." She didn't have dealings with him, but she watched him the way she watched everything in Red Hollow carefully from a slight distance, filing away information the way other people filed away money. What she observed over the course of that afternoon, Ethan Calloway did not swagger. Men with badges in the Arizona Territory had a tendency to let the authority do the work of their personality, to use the official weight of the thing to fill up the space around them. Calloway moved like the badge was almost incidental. He spoke to the local sheriff, a man named Briggs, no relation to the seamstress, with a red face and a defensive posture, with the particular courtesy of someone who had learned to get information out of proud men without making them feel diminished in the process. He went into the Golden Spur. He came out 20 minutes later with a ledger under his arm. He stopped 2 men on the street, spoke to each, briefly listened more than he talked. He had a way of going still when someone was speaking to him. Not the stillness of boredom or impatience, but of full attention, like he was committing every word to a record he kept somewhere inside that nobody else could access. Clara noticed all of this and told herself she was simply being observant. She was always observant. It was a survival skill. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she was still on the bench outside the post office because she had made approximately no progress on her situation, and the heat was slightly more bearable in the shade there than anywhere else. She had made a list in her head: what she had, what she needed, what was possible. What she had: $14 carpet bag, 2 weeks of room sharp. Mind-specific knowledge of every significant transaction, conversation, and arrangement she'd witnessed in 3 years at the Golden Spur. What she needed: work, income, a future that didn't end in Tombstone. What was possible? Unclear. She was on that last item, running it from several angles, when she became aware that someone had stopped in front of her. She looked up. Ethan Calloway was standing in the street, not quite on the boardwalk, at a distance that was respectful rather than confrontational. He had the ledger tucked under his left arm. His hat was pulled slightly against the afternoon sun. He did not look like a man making conversation. He looked like a man with a specific question. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low and level, and had the particular measured quality of someone who had trained themselves not to waste words. "That's right," Clara said. "I'm Deputy Marshal Calloway. I've been assigned to the hatch investigation." "I figured." He looked at her for a moment, taking in the bench, the bag, the particular exhausted composure of a woman who had been turned away from several doors without losing her spine. "I have some questions about the Golden Spur's operations," he said. "Specifically about the backroom activity over the past 3 years. I understand you worked the floor." "I did. I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." She studied him. She had been studied by men all her life and rarely got to do the studying herself, and she took the opportunity seriously. "What happens if I'm not willing?" she asked. Something moved in his expression. Not irritation, something closer to respect. "Then you're not willing," he said. "I can compel testimony in front of a judge, but that's a different matter than a conversation. I'm asking for a conversation." "You could compel it." "I could. I'd rather not. People remember things differently when they're scared." Clara considered this. "There's a condition." "Tell me the condition." "Whatever I tell you, I need it on record that I had no knowledge of the fraud. Not just your understanding. Official record. Written, signed." He didn't hesitate. "That's a reasonable condition. I can do that." "Then I'll talk to you." He nodded. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You might not like everything I know." The closest thing to a smile crossed his face. Not a full smile, just the suggestion of one, like an expression practiced so rarely it had almost forgotten how. "I've found that the most useful information is usually the kind I don't expect," he said. They talked for 2 hours. Not at the marshal's office, which would have been noticed and commented on and added to Clara's already considerable social difficulties. At the small table in the back of Hannigan's restaurant, which was nearly empty at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, and where old Hannigan himself had the particular decency of a man who fed everyone who could pay and asked no questions about anything. Clara talked, and Calloway listened with that complete attention of his, and occasionally he asked a question specific surgical. The kind of question that told her he already knew a great deal, and was testing the shape of what she knew against it. She told him about the nights certain men came through after closing, the way Hatch sent everyone else home and kept one lamp burning in the back office, the names she'd heard county surveyor, land office clerk, a judge from 2 towns over, whose name she'd caught once and remembered because you remembered things like that when you were Clara Whitmore, because information was currency, and currency was survival. She told him about the ledger that was kept separate from the official one. She'd seen it twice, leather-bound, thinner than the main accounts book, kept in the bottom drawer of Hatch's desk. Calloway looked at the ledger under his arm. "This one?" he asked. She looked at it. "No, smaller, different binding." He made a note. She told him about a man named Rourke who'd come in from the land office 3 times in 6 months, always alone, always late, always left with something in his coat pocket that hadn't been there when he walked in. Calloway wrote it down without a word. When she was done, she folded her hands on the table and waited. He looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at her. "This is considerably more than I expected," he said. "I pay attention." "Clearly." He considered something. "May I ask what your plans are, going forward?" Clara kept her expression level. "Looking for work, making plans." "Any success with the work?" She didn't answer that immediately. "None," she said finally, because there was no point in performing dignity. She didn't have enough room to afford right now. He nodded once. He looked at the table, then back at her. "I have a small house outside of town," he said. "On the north side. I'm going to be in Red Hollow for at least 4 to 6 weeks while this case develops. The house has a spare room." Clara went very still. "I'm saying it plain," he said, and his voice was steady and matter-of-fact as a man describing weather. "Not because of any other reason. You've given me useful testimony, and you're in a difficult position through no fault of your own, and there's a room. You'd have your own space. I'm away most of the day." She studied his face. She had learned to read men's faces the way some people learn to read weather, by necessity, by survival, by the particular education of having your safety depend on getting it right. What she read in Ethan Calloway's face was the same thing she'd noticed when he rode into town. Not appetite, not dismissal, just accuracy. He was telling her a fact, a practical fact. Room house 4 to 6 weeks. "Why?" she said. "Because it seems like the right thing to do," he said, like that was a simple sentence, instead of the most complicated sentence in the English language. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll pay for the room," she said. "You don't need to." "I'll pay for the room," she said again. Not a question. He looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face, just as she'd been reading his. "All right," he said. "Fair enough." She stood up and picked up her carpet bag. "I've got $14, she said, "and more self-respect than Red Hollow can figure out what to do with. You should know what you're getting." He stood up from the table and settled his hat. "Sounds like you've got everything you need, Miss Whitmore." She almost said something to that. She stopped herself. She followed him out of Hannigan's into the hot Arizona evening, into the burnt gold light of a summer sun sliding toward the mountains. Red Hollow watched. It always watched. She could feel the town's eyes on her back like a brand. Let it watch, she thought. She had walked out of worse than this. She had walked out of a childhood that would have laid most people flat, out of a marriage at 19 that lasted 8 months, and left her with a last name she'd kept only because starting over with nothing was easier, with some kind of continuity. She had walked out of a town in New Mexico that made Red Hollow look generous. She had walked out of every single thing that had tried to be the end of her. She was not done walking. Ethan Calloway's horse was tied outside the restaurant. He untied it and led it by the reins, walking beside her toward the north end of town. He didn't offer to carry her bag. She appreciated that more than she could say. The house was small and clean, and smelled like pine resin and coffee and a particular absence. The particular absence of a woman's presence, not in any sad way, but simply in the way of a man who lived alone and had made peace with it. The spare room had a bed and a window that looked out toward the mountains. The mountains in the evening light were the color of dried blood, and old copper enormous and indifferent, the way only mountains could be. And Clara stood at the window for a moment and felt something in her chest go slightly less rigid. "There's food in the kitchen," Calloway said from the doorway. "I'll be out early tomorrow. Make yourself at home." "I'll earn my keep," she said. "I didn't ask you to." "I know. I'm telling you anyway." He looked at her for a moment. That reading look. Then he nodded and moved away down the hall, and she heard the front door open and close as he went out to see to his horse. Clara set the carpetbag on the floor and sat down on the edge of the bed. She was still alive. She had a room. She had information that the territorial marshal's office now needed, which meant she had a certain temporary but real value. She had 2 weeks before the $14 ran out, and inside those 2 weeks she would figure something out. She had always figured something out. Outside the window, the Arizona mountains held their color for a while longer, burning slow against the darkening sky. She watched them, and she thought about the town below and the people in it, and the way Harold Greer had wiped a counter that didn't need wiping. She thought about Ethan Calloway saying the most complicated simple sentence she'd ever heard. "It seems like the right thing to do." As if that were sufficient. As if righteousness were a reason instead of a luxury. She had not met many people who lived their lives that simply. She wasn't sure yet whether to trust it. But she was here. She was fed. She was alive. And in the morning she would see what a new day in an unexpected place looked like. In the 3 years she had lived in Red Hollow, she had never once looked at the mountains from a window that faced north. She looked at them now and decided that was not nothing. Outside, the summer dark came down over Arizona like a slow tide, and somewhere in the heat a coyote announced itself to the night, and Red Hollow went quiet in the way of small towns that have finished their gossip for the day and are saving the rest for morning. Clara Whitmore did not sleep right away. She sat in the dark, and she made her plans, and she did not let herself feel anything she couldn't afford to feel. But the mountains were still there in the window, when her eyes finally closed dark against the stars, solid as anything she had ever tried to build on. It was enough for now. It was enough. Clara woke before dawn. Not because anything startled her, not because the house made strange noises, though it did, old timber settling against the desert cold that came every night, no matter how brutal the day had been. She woke because her body had learned over many years and many uncertain situations that sleeping past first light was a luxury she could not count on. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The room, the window, the mountains barely visible now as dark shapes against a sky going from black to deep purple. Calloway's house. She was in Calloway's house. She got up. The kitchen was small and functional, and told her things about him the way a person's space always did if you knew how to look. No clutter, no unnecessary objects. The kind of order that came not from fussiness, but from a man who had learned to keep his environment under control, because so many other things could not be. There were 3 cups on the shelf, just 3, and she wondered briefly why 3 when he lived alone. There was a coffee pot well used and a cast-iron skillet that had been seasoned over years of honest cooking. There was flour and lard and dried beans and cornmeal and salt pork. Clara built a fire and made coffee, and then stood there in the early dark drinking it because she had spent too many mornings running to spend this one doing anything else. She heard him before she saw him, boot heels on the wooden floor, steady and unhurried, the sound of a man who was already completely awake and had been for a while. Ethan Calloway came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the fire going and the coffee on. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the recalibration of a man who had expected to find one thing and found another. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." Clara poured a second cup and set it on the table. "Sit down. You look like you've been awake for 2 hours already." He sat. He picked up the cup and drank without ceremony, and she recognized something in that, the way a person behaves when they've stopped performing for other people. He wasn't performing anything. "I'm heading into town at first light," he said. "I'll be at the marshal's office most of the day. Briggs is going to be difficult." "Briggs is always difficult," Clara said. She sat down across from him. "He was difficult before you got here. He has a particular fondness for Gerald Hatch that I never quite understood until I understood it." Calloway looked at her across the cup. Meaning Briggs ate at the Golden Spur twice a week and never paid a cent for it." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "That's what I didn't get the chance to tell you yesterday. Hatch kept a list of what he called his arrangements. The meals, the drinks, the occasional other considerations that kept certain people looking in certain directions." Calloway set his cup down. "Was Briggs on that list by name, by initial? But there weren't that many Bs in Red Hollow with any kind of authority, and only one of them had a taste for the good whiskey Hatch kept locked up for special customers." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. "You said yesterday that you'd seen the private ledger twice," he said. "I did." "Could you identify the handwriting if you saw it again?" Clara considered. "I could identify the ledger itself. It had a water stain on the front cover shaped like a boot heel. Hatch was sentimental about strange things. He kept it because the stain happened the night he claims he first turned a real profit. He told me that once when he'd had too much of his own good whiskey." Something sharpened in Calloway's expression. "He told you that?" "He told me a lot of things. Men who employ women to be pleasant to them often forget that pleasant and invisible are two different states." She met his eyes. "I was never invisible." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "I can see that." He finished his coffee and stood, put on his hat, and took his duster from the hook by the door. Paused with his hand on the doorframe. "There's money in the tin on the second shelf," he said. "If you need anything from town, don't argue with me about it." "I'll argue with you about it tomorrow," Clara said. "Today, I'll just leave it there." Something crossed his face again, that near smile, that ghost of expression. Then he was gone, and she heard the horse, and then nothing but the desert waking up around her. She sat at the table for a long while. Then she got up and started cleaning things that didn't need cleaning because her hands needed to be busy while her mind worked. Her mind was working very hard. Ted. She went into town at 9 o'clock because there were things she needed and things she needed to know, and standing still had never been something Clara Whitmore was built for. Red Hollow in the morning was a different creature than Red Hollow in the afternoon. Quieter. More honest, somehow, the way places were before they'd had time to construct their public faces for the day. She walked the main street with her head level and her pace steady, and she felt the eyes on her the same way she always did, that particular weight of collective attention that was either going to break you or build you into something harder. She chose harder. She always chose harder. The first person to speak to her was May Dugan, who was 53 years old and ran the laundry on the west side of Calhoun Street, and had in 3 years spoken to Clara maybe a dozen times, always politely, always briefly, always with the careful demeanor of a woman who had her own position to protect and didn't need other people's complications. May was coming out of the bakery with a paper-wrapped loaf when she saw Clara, and for a moment she did that thing, that slight pause, that recalculation, and Clara braced herself. "Clara," May said, and then, to Clara's considerable surprise, "I heard what happened with the Golden Spur." "Word travels," Clara said. "In Red Hollow it travels before the thing has finished happening." May stood there holding her bread, looking at Clara with something that was more complicated than the town's usual collective verdict. "For what it's worth, I don't believe you had any part in what Hatch was doing." Clara kept her expression even. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kind," May said, with the particular sharpness of a woman who didn't want to be credited with emotions she hadn't chosen carefully. "It's just accurate. You were working a job, same as the rest of us." Clara looked at her for a moment. "May, are you building up to something?" May's mouth tightened. Then she said, "I need someone 2 days a week, for the laundry. The girl I had went and got married last month and her husband won't let her work." She said this with a flatness that conveyed exactly what she thought of that arrangement. "It's not glamorous, and it doesn't pay what you probably need, but it's honest, and I don't care about your past address." Clara was quiet for 3 full seconds. "I can do 3 days," she said, "if you need them." "2's what I need. 3's what I'll take." May shifted the bread under her arm. "Be there at 7 on Thursday." "I'll be there at 6:30, Clara said. May gave her a look that was almost warm. 6:30 then." She started moving away, then stopped. "Clara, about the hotel and that Briggs woman on Calhoun Street." "You know about that." "Like I said, word travels." May's voice was dry. "Not everyone agrees with them." She walked away before Clara could respond. Clara stood in the middle of the boardwalk and did not allow herself to feel too much about this, because too much feeling was dangerous when you were still inside the storm and not yet out of it. But she noted it. Noted it very specifically, filed it away in the part of herself where she kept things that mattered. One door in Red Hollow had opened this morning. One door was more than 0. She was crossing back through the center of town, heading toward the Mercantile for the few things she needed when she heard it. The shouting was coming from the direction of the marshal's office, which in Red Hollow was a small building attached to the county jail, 2 rooms, and a collection of grievances that dated back to the town's founding. She heard Briggs first because Briggs had a voice built for projection, a red-faced carrying voice that moved through walls and windows without apology. "You don't have jurisdiction over my department's business, Calloway. This is a local matter. Gerald Hatch defrauded landowners across 3 counties and bribed at minimum 1 county official." Calloway's voice was the opposite of Briggs's lower, steadier. The kind of voice that made you lean toward it to hear better, which meant you were already paying attention by the time it finished the sentence. "That makes it territorial jurisdiction. You know that, Briggs. You're reaching. I have the ledger. I have witness testimony. I have a record of payments made to at least 1 member of the local law enforcement." A pause. "So I'd encourage you to be very careful about what you say next." Clara had stopped walking. She was outside the window, not pressed against it, not hiding, just standing on the boardwalk at a distance that let her hear everything with complete clarity, which was absolutely an accident and had nothing to do with the fact that she had been listening at walls since she was old enough to understand that walls contained information. Briggs's voice dropped. She couldn't make out the words now, but the tone shifted, the bluster running out of it like water out of a cracked basin. Then Calloway again. "I'm going to need access to your office records going back to 1882. All of them." Silence. "I'll have them ready by end of day." Briggs's voice came out flat and carved up, the voice of a man who had just understood exactly how his morning had changed. Clara moved on before anyone came out the door. Her heart was doing something uncomfortable in her chest. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. Something more electric than fear. The particular feeling of a situation becoming real, of pieces moving into alignment of a thing that had seemed like it might be buried, becoming something that might instead be uncovered. Hatch's fraud was bigger than the saloon. She had known that in the way you know things you've assembled from fragments. A word here, a name there, a number that didn't add up. She hadn't known the shape of it until she'd told Calloway, and watched his face arrange itself into the particular expression of a man whose existing picture is having new details added to it. She had given him the boot heel ledger, the Briggs arrangement, the surveyor's name, the land office clerk. She had given him a case. The thought arrived before she could stop it. She was either very useful or very exposed, and in her experience, those 2 things had a tendency to change places without warning. She bought flour and salt, and a 1/4 pound of dried apricots, because she had not had dried apricots in 3 years, and she was going to have them now. And she walked back toward the north end of town with her purchases and her thoughts and the particular awareness that the ground under Red Hollow was shifting and she was standing on it. Calloway came home at 7 that evening. Clara had made supper beans and cornbread and salt pork, and she had set 2 places at the table because it seemed absurd to set one when there were 2 people in the house. She heard the horse, heard him in the yard, heard his boots on the steps, and she had a specific decision to make in the 10 seconds before the door opened: look busy doing something or just sit there. She sat there. He came in and saw the table and did the recalibration again, that slight adjustment of expectation. "You cook," he said. "I've been cooking since I was 8, she said. "Sit down." He took off his hat and his duster and hung them up. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down and looked at the food and then at her. And she could see the day on him. The weight of it. Whatever had happened past the conversation with Briggs, that she'd overheard the particular kind of tired that came from fighting upstream against people who had every reason to obstruct you. "I heard you and Briggs," she said. "This morning. I wasn't trying to listen." "I know," he said in a tone that suggested he'd known she was there and had said exactly what he'd said regardless. She looked at him. "You knew." "I saw you out the window." He picked up his fork. "I wasn't saying anything I wouldn't have said to your face." Clara sat with that for a moment. He's going to be a problem. He's already a problem. Calloway ate a bite of the beans, and she watched something in his face ease slightly, the way it does when the body gets something it needed. Briggs has been covering for Hatch since 1882. That's 5 years. There are people in this county who bought land on fraudulent deeds and have been paying mortgages to a man who didn't legitimately own the property they're living on. Clara set her fork down. "How many families?" He looked at her. 26 that we know of. Probably more." She absorbed this. 26 families. People she might have served coffee to, might have smiled at across the bar. People who had looked through her, or past her, or with whatever judgment small towns attach to women who worked saloons. 26 of them living on land they thought they owned, that had been stolen from someone else, that the county record said was legitimate because the county records had been altered. "Some of those families," she said slowly, "came in every week. The Harpers. The Dunleavy family, they've got 3 children. Old Mr. Sorensen out on the North Road, he bought his land with money he saved for 20 years. "I know." "They don't know yet," she said. "Do they?" "Not yet. We have to build the case first. If we move too early and Hatch's connections find out what we know, the documentation disappears and we lose everything." He looked at her steadily. "Which is why what you told me yesterday matters as much as it does. The private ledger, the arrangement with the land office clerk, those are the links that hold the case together." Clara was quiet. "You told me yesterday," he said, "that you were never invisible." "I did. The woman who kept that information, all of it for 3 years, every name and every transaction she couldn't have known she'd ever need, she's the reason 26 families might get their land back." He said it simply, without decoration. "I thought you should know that." Clara looked across the table at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who cried. She had cried all she was going to cry somewhere around the age of 16, and since then had converted that energy into things she could actually use. But something moved in her chest that was adjacent to it, that had the same weight without the release. "You're telling me my 3 years there weren't just 3 years of surviving," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." She picked up her fork again. "Don't make me into something I'm not," she said. "I wasn't keeping records for the sake of justice. I was keeping them because knowledge was the only thing I had that nobody could take." "I'm not making you into anything," he said. "I'm telling you what you are." The silence after that was different from the other silences they'd had. More settled, more mutual. Clara ate her beans and thought about the Harper family and the Dunleavys and old Mr. Sorensen. And she felt the weight of 26 families sitting somewhere just behind her sternum, pressing there, and she thought about how strange life was, that 3 years of being invisible might turn out to be the most important 3 years of her life. She woke the next morning to find a note on the kitchen table. Calloway's handwriting was plain and angular and wasted nothing on flourishes. Went to county records office. Back by noon. Rourke from the land office is coming in this afternoon. Your account of him may be needed. C. She made coffee and stood at the window and thought about Rourke. Arthur Rourke was 44 years old and had the particular soft-handedness of a man who had never done physical labor in his life. He had come into the Golden Spur 3 times in 6 months. Always on Wednesdays, always after 9, always ordered the same thing. Rye whiskey, 1 glass slowly. He was not a drinker. The glass took him 40 minutes. He was there for the back room, and he always came out with his coat pocket heavier than it had been going in. She had seen this clearly because she had been the one refilling his glass once, partway through the 40 minutes, to give him reason to stay at the table if he wanted to leave before his business was done. She did not know at the time that she was watching the mechanism of a fraud. She had simply watched the way she always watched because it was the only reliable thing she'd ever had. Calloway came back at 11:30, which was earlier than the note had promised, and he came back moving at a pace that was slightly faster than his usual measured stride. Not running, not obviously urgent, but with the compressed energy of a man who had found something. He came into the kitchen and set a sheaf of papers on the table. The county records office keeps copies of every land transaction, he said. I had access to the 1882 to 1887 files. There are 53 transactions in that window that reference a survey conducted by a man named Elias Dean, who is listed in the county employment records as a certified surveyor. I know that name, Clara said immediately. She frowned, pulling it. He never came into the Spur, but Hatch mentioned him twice that I remember. Once in a way that suggested Dean wasn't going to be a problem, and once in a way that suggested Dean was expensive. Calloway looked up from the papers. Elias Dean died in 1879. Clara went very still. He's been dead for 8 years, Calloway said. Every survey filed under his name after 1879 is forged. 53 land transactions, all of them fraudulent. The air in the kitchen changed. 26 families had just become something much larger. 53 transactions, some of those would be the same families, some would be multiple parcels, but the scope of it had just expanded in a way that altered the shape of everything. Rourke, Clara said. He's the land office clerk. He's the one filing the surveys. And accepting payment for doing it, Calloway said, which is what was in his coat pocket. Can you prove that? Not yet. I need the private ledger. He looked at her. Which means I need to know if Hatch has it with him or if it's somewhere else. He's being held at the county jail in Prescott, but the territorial judge won't arraign him until next week. If someone gets to that ledger first, it disappears, Clara said. Everything disappears. He sat down at the table spreading the papers, and she could see him working the problem in real time, not frantically, but with the focused, methodical intensity of someone who had learned to think under pressure, and had been thinking under pressure for a very long time. She sat across from him. Is there anywhere in that building he'd keep something he needed to stay hidden? Not just locked up hidden. Calloway glanced up. I was in that office, she said. 3 times that I can count when Hatch forgot I was there, because he thought I was just part of the furniture. The bottom drawer is too obvious. He knew that that's where he kept the regular accounts, the things he wanted people to find if they went looking, so they'd stop looking. She paused. She was pulling something from the texture of those 3 years. There was a loose board, she said slowly, in the floor behind his desk. I saw him use it once when he thought I'd already left. He was putting something in, something small. He pressed the board back down and moved the chair over it. Calloway went completely still. You never told anyone that, he said. Nobody ever asked the right way, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table. I need to get into the Golden Spur, he said. Today. Before Rourke's interview, in case Rourke has already warned someone. The deputy, the one with the ink-stained fingers, he has the key. I know. He was already moving. Calloway. He stopped in the doorway. She met his eyes. If the ledger's there, what does it mean for the people on those fraudulent deeds? He held her gaze. It means they get their land, their real land, with clean title. He paused. And it means Gerald Hatch spends the next 15 years in territorial prison. He left. Clara stood in the kitchen and heard the horse. She thought about the loose board under the chair in Hatch's office, about the particular evening she'd seen him use it, about how she'd finished drying the glass in her hand and put it away quietly and walked out as if she'd seen nothing at all. She had filed that image away so carefully in such a deep and automatic place that she hadn't even known she still had it until this moment. She had not been invisible. She had been watching everything, storing everything, carrying 3 years of this town's secrets in the most reliable archive available herself. Rourke came in at 3 o'clock. Clara knew because she had gone into town at 2 to meet May Dugan briefly about Thursday's arrangement, and she was at the end of Calhoun Street when she saw Rourke walking toward the marshal's office. He was wearing his good coat even though the heat was brutal. His face was composed in the careful way of a man who had decided how he was going to play this. She almost kept walking. Then she turned around and went to Hannigan's restaurant instead, because it was 2 doors from the marshal's office and had a window that faced the right direction, and she sat down with a cup of coffee and watched the door. Calloway had come back from the Golden Spur 40 minutes before. She had not been there to see him return, but she had seen him go into the marshal's office at 2:15 with something tucked under his arm, and the way he carried it told her everything. He had found the ledger. Rourke went into the marshal's office at 3:02 and came out at 4:17. Clara had finished 2 cups of coffee and was starting on her third, and old Hannigan hadn't asked her a single question, which she appreciated. Rourke came out looking like a man who had just had the floor taken out from under him. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, collecting himself, straightening his coat. Then he walked very quickly in the direction of the land office. Not running, but very quickly. Clara watched him go. She was still sitting there when Calloway came out of the marshal's office 10 minutes later and looked down the street, and then, without seeming to look for her, his gaze found the window where she was sitting. He came into Hannigan's and sat down across from her. "He talked," she said. It wasn't a question. "He talked," Calloway confirmed. He looked like a man who had just carried something heavy for a long distance and had not yet put it all the way down. All of it. Rourke Briggs, 2 county commissioners, and a judge in Maricopa County who's been on Hatch's arrangement for 4 years. Clara set her coffee cup down carefully. "The ledger," she said. "The ledger." He leaned back in the chair slightly. "It has every arrangement, every payment, every name dated and recorded in Hatch's own hand. He kept it for protection. He said so nobody could turn on him without taking themselves down too." "He was protecting himself from his own conspirators," Clara said. "Yes. And now it protects 26 families." She paused. 53 transactions. 53 transactions, he said. The afternoon light was doing something to the room, that late-day Arizona gold, that made everything look briefly like it was made of something more valuable than it actually was. She was aware of it, and then she wasn't, because Calloway was looking at her with that precise attention of his, that reading the room look, that was also a reading the person look. "There's going to be a hearing," he said, "in front of the territorial judge, probably within the month. I'm going to need your formal testimony, everything you've already told me, plus the floorboard. I know. Red Hollow is going to know you were central to this," he said, "that you gave the testimony that built the case." She looked at him. "Is that a warning?" "It's information," he said. "Some people in this town have reason to be grateful. Some people have reason to be angry." He paused. "The angry ones tend to make more noise." "That's true everywhere," Clara said. "Are you ready for that?" She thought about May Dugan this morning. 1 door. She thought about the Harper family and the Dunleavys and old Mr. Sorensen, about 26 families, 53 transactions, a surveyor dead since 1879, and a ledger hidden under a loose board that she alone had known about. She thought about 3 years of surviving inside a place she hadn't chosen, of keeping herself small and watchful and careful, of telling herself this was temporary. This was a stepping stone. This was not who she was. She thought about the carpetbag hitting the dirt on Tuesday afternoon. "Deputy Marshal Calloway," she said. "I have been ready for difficult things since I was considerably younger than I am now. What I have not always had is a reason." He looked at her. "I have a reason now," she said. She picked up her coffee cup and drank the last of it. Outside the window of Hannigan's restaurant, Red Hollow went on being itself the main street traffic. The afternoon heat, the town that had closed its doors on Tuesday and was going to have to find a different story to tell about Clara Whitmore by the time the territorial judge arrived. She was going to let it find that story. She was going to be standing there upright and clear-eyed and entirely herself when it did. Calloway stood up from the table and put on his hat. He looked down at her with that expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was the architecture of one. "Thursday," he said. "I'll need you at the marshal's office to review your statement." "I'll be there at 8, she said. 6:30, he said. She looked up at him sharply. Something in his face, just the slightest ease in it. "If you're going to be early," he said, "at least be early to something that matters." He walked out of Hannigan's into the afternoon heat, and she sat there for a moment, looking at the door where he'd been, and she felt that thing again, that guarded thing, that memory of hope, carrying the same shape as hope itself. She picked up her bag. She left 2 coins on the table for Hannigan, more than the coffee cost. Then she walked out into Red Hollow, into the heat and the dust and the watching eyes, and she walked like a woman who had business in this town, who had always had business in this town, who was only now beginning to know it. Thursday came in like every other Arizona summer day, hard and bright and without apology. Clara was at the laundry on Calhoun Street at 6:20 because she had said 6:30, and she did not like to be late. And she had the particular compulsion of a woman who had spent too many years at the mercy of other people's schedules to ever be careless with her own time. May Dugan opened the door at 6:25, looked at her and said nothing about the earliness. She just handed Clara an apron and pointed to the copper tubs. They worked side by side for 3 hours without talking much. May was not a woman who filled silence with noise, and Clara appreciated that in the way you appreciate people who are built similarly to yourself, with recognition and with relief. The work was physical and repetitive, and left enough of her mind free to keep turning over everything that had happened since Tuesday. 4 days. 4 days since the carpetbag hit the dirt. 4 days since the whole architecture of her life in Red Hollow had collapsed and something else, something she didn't have a name for yet, had started being built in its place. "You're thinking hard," May said around 9 o'clock, without looking up from the shirt she was wringing out. "I'm always thinking hard," Clara said. "About the Hatch case." Clara looked at her sidelong. Word traveled again. Word never stopped. May dropped the shirt into the rinse basin. "They're saying Calloway found something in the Golden Spur. Something Hatch hid." Clara said nothing. "They're also saying," May continued in the same dry, even tone, "that a woman gave testimony that broke the case open. Nobody's saying your name yet. But it's only a matter of time before someone does the arithmetic. When they do," Clara said, "they'll say it like it's a crime. Some of them will." May looked at her directly, which was something May didn't do often and which meant it mattered. "Some of them won't." Clara held her gaze. "Which kind are you?" "I'm the kind," May said, "who put an apron in your hands at 6:25 in the morning. You do the arithmetic." She went back to the laundry, and Clara went back to the laundry. And between them, a small and practical thing settled into place that was not yet friendship, but was the honest material from which friendship is sometimes made. She was at the marshal's office at 8 o'clock, exactly as she'd said. Calloway was already there, already moving, and he had that compressed quality again. The same energy she'd seen when he'd come home with the survey documents. The focused urgency of a man working against a clock he hadn't told her about yet. He had maps spread across the table, and a second man in the room that Clara didn't recognize, younger than Calloway by 10 years, with sharp dark eyes and the kind of lean, watchful build that suggested he'd come up the same way through the same education of difficult country and harder decisions. "Miss Whitmore," Calloway said. "This is Deputy Marshal Cole Ardent out of Prescott. He rode in this morning." Cole Ardent looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who had been briefed. "Ma'am, Calloway tells me you know this county's business better than anyone in it." "I know the business of the people who came through the Golden Spur," Clara said, "which turns out to be most of it." "We're going to need all of it," Ardent said. He was not unkind. He was simply operating at speed the way the situation required. "We have a hearing date, 2 weeks from today in front of Judge Harlan Morse out of Prescott. Hatch's attorney filed for dismissal yesterday on grounds of unlawful search of the Golden Spur." Clara looked at Calloway. "Can he do that?" "He can file it," Calloway said. "The argument won't hold. The premises were already in territorial custody as evidence in a criminal investigation. But it's going to delay things, and delay is the point. Every day the hearing is pushed back is another day for Hatch's remaining connections to move documentation, relocate funds, put pressure on potential witnesses." The word witnesses landed in the room with a specific weight. "You mean me," Clara said. "Among others," Ardent said. "There are 2 former Golden Spur employees who've already been approached. One of them has left town." Clara felt something cold move through her despite the heat. "Who?" "Billy Crane. He worked the bar." She knew Billy Crane. 18 years old, Quick Hands had been saving money to send home to his mother in Flagstaff. He was young, and he had been frightened, and he had left, and she couldn't blame him for it. "Who approached him?" she asked. Calloway and Ardent exchanged a look. "We believe," Calloway said carefully, "it was someone connected to the county commission, specifically to one of the commissioners named in Hatch's ledger." "Commissioner Aldrich," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "He came in on the first Monday of every month," she said. "Not for the whiskey he didn't drink. He ate. He always ordered the same thing, and he always ate it in the booth in the back corner, and he always left within 15 minutes of Hatch disappearing into the back office." She paused. "He has a scar on his right hand from an old burn. He wore his watch on that wrist, I think, to cover it." Ardent made a note. "You remember all of it?" "All of it," she said. "That's what I do." "Then you understand," Calloway said, "why you're the witness they have most reason to be worried about." He said it plainly, not to frighten her, because she had asked for plainness, and he had learned in 4 days that she could take it. She could take it. She stood there in the marshal's office in Red Hollow, Arizona Territory, 1887, and she took it, and she did not step back from it. "What do you need from me?" she said. They worked through the morning, the 3 of them, building the formal structure of her testimony. It was painstaking work. Ardent was precise in the way of a man who understood that testimony lost in technicality was testimony lost entirely, and he asked her the same questions from different angles, until he was satisfied that her account was consistent from every approach. Not because he doubted her, because Hatch's attorney would not doubt her for a moment, and would spend every resource he had making a jury doubt her instead. Clara answered every question. She answered them clearly and without embellishment because she understood instinctively what Ardent was doing, and she had no interest in giving Hatch's attorney anything to pull apart. Calloway mostly listened. Occasionally, he asked a question of his own, and his questions were different from Ardent's, less procedural, more directional. The kind of question that helped her locate a memory more precisely. He knew how her mind worked now, the way her recall operated, what she needed to bring something back into full focus. 4 days. She had known him 4 days, and he had learned how her mind worked. She pushed that thought aside and kept her focus on Ardent's questions. At noon, Ardent went out to send a wire to Prescott, and Calloway poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the office stove, and they sat in the brief quiet of a room that had been working hard all morning. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "Testimony. Staying precise under pressure. Most people drift, they add, they qualify, they second-guess themselves when they feel they're being tested." He drank his coffee. "You don't drift." I can't afford to drift, she said. That's what I mean. He set the cup down. You've been operating in an environment your whole life where accuracy was survival. You don't embellish because embellishment creates vulnerabilities. You don't minimize because minimizing loses the thread. He looked at her steadily. That's not common, Miss Whitmore. Clara looked at the coffee in her cup. You make it sound like a gift. Isn't it? It's a thing I developed because I had no alternative, she said. Same as most things people call gifts. He was quiet for a moment. I had a commanding officer in the war, he said, and she heard the slight shift in his voice, something that opened just slightly the way a door opens an inch, and you can feel the air from a different room. Colonel Hartley Dix. He used to say that the most valuable soldier wasn't the strongest or the fastest. It was the one who could observe accurately under pressure and report exactly what he saw. No more, no less. He paused. He said men died when their observers got poetic. Clara looked up at him. He was studying the wall across the room the way people study something neutral when they're actually looking at something internal. You were a scout, she said. Union scout, frontier detail after the war. His jaw moved slightly. 4 years. That's where the badge came from. The work that led to the badge. Different stations, different territories. Red Hollow is the 12th case in 6 years. He picked up the coffee cup again, and the brief opening closed itself not abruptly, just quietly, the way it had opened. I move when the work moves. You don't stay anywhere. I haven't yet. Clara considered this. The 3 cups on the shelf, she said. He looked at her. You have 3 cups. You live alone. Most men who live alone have 1, maybe 2. 3 means you think about having company, even when you don't have it. Something moved across his face, slow and careful and real. Or, he said, 1 broke and I bought 3 because they came that way at the mercantile. Did it? A pause. No. She nodded, looked back at her coffee. The room was very quiet. Where did you come from? He said. Before Red Hollow. New Mexico, she said. Before that, Missouri. Before that, a farm in Kentucky that doesn't exist anymore. She kept her voice level. I married at 19. He was not a cruel man, just an absent one, and in the end absent and cruel produced the same result. I left when I understood he was never going to become the person I needed him to be. And the saloon work was not what I intended for my life, she said. It was what was available to a woman without references, without family, without funds, in a town that offered 2 options: domestic service or the saloon floor. I chose the one that paid better and required less pretending to be smaller than I was. She met his eyes. I was never ashamed of the work. I'm not ashamed of it now. He held her gaze. I know that. Some people can't get past it. I'm not some people. She believed him. That was the strange part. She believed him without the usual lengthy verification process she ran every person through before she allowed herself to believe anything they said. She believed Ethan Calloway because everything about him operated at the same frequency, internal and external, the same man. Whether he was talking to Briggs or eating beans at his own kitchen table, or sitting in the marshal's office telling her she didn't drift. Ardent came back and the morning's work resumed, and Clara filed the moment away in that deep, reliable place and kept going. The first threat came on Friday. It was not dramatic. Threats rarely were in her experience. The dramatic ones were usually just noise men who wanted to feel powerful without paying the cost of actual action. The quiet ones were what you watched for. A note, folded once, slid under the door of Calloway's house sometime before dawn. Clara found it when she went to get water from the pump, and it was sitting on the floor just inside the front door. She picked it up and read it. It said, "Some testimony is better left unspoken. Consider your future, Miss W." No signature. Plain handwriting, the kind that had been made plain deliberately. The paper was standard, the kind available in the mercantile, in the land office, in the hotel, in any of a dozen places. She folded it again and set it on the kitchen table and made the coffee. Calloway found it when he came in for breakfast. He picked it up, read it, set it down. His expression did not change. "Are you frightened?" he asked her. She thought about the question seriously the way it deserved. "I'm alert," she said. "Frightened is when you stop thinking clearly. I'm still thinking clearly." "Good." He pocketed the note. "I want you to vary your route when you go into town. Don't be predictable about timing." "I know how to be unpredictable," she said. "I've been doing it since New Mexico." "I know you do." He looked at her across the table. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It arrived simply without announcement, just dropped into the sentence, as if it had always belonged there. "I need you to understand," he said, "that I take this seriously. The note is a warning, which means someone is watching the house, which means they know you're here, which means they've made a decision that you're a threat significant enough to warn." He held her gaze. "That's both good and bad. Good because it means the testimony is solid enough to frighten them," Clara said. "Bad because frightened people are unpredictable." "Yes." She poured her coffee and sat down. "What do you want to do?" "Ardent is going to put a watch on the house at night. I'll be here most evenings now. And—" He paused as if considering how to say the next part. "I want you to think about whether there's anyone else in Red Hollow who might have witnessed things at the Golden Spur. Anyone you trust," she thought. "May Dugan," she said slowly. "She's not a witness. She was never in the Spur. But she knows this town. She knows which families are on the fraudulent deeds. She knows who talks to whom. She knows the networks." She paused. "And she's not afraid of much. Would she talk to me?" "She'd talk to you if I asked her to," Clara said. "May does things on her own terms, but she has terms you can work with." He nodded. "Set it up." He left. She heard the horse. She sat in the kitchen with her coffee and the ghost of his voice saying her name. Clara. Just that. Just the word, like it was a thing he'd always known and was only now using. She gave herself 30 seconds to feel whatever that was. Then she got up and went to work. The thing about a town like Red Hollow was that it operated on 2 levels simultaneously. There was the level everyone performed, the public face, the church attendance, the commerce, the social positions maintained through carefully calibrated courtesy. And then there was the other level, the one that ran underneath, the one that kept the actual truth of the place alive through whisper networks and kitchen conversations, and the particular intelligence of women who had been underestimated so long that everyone had stopped watching what they said in front of them. Clara had always lived on both levels. She had performed the first level because it was required, and she had survived on the second level because it was true. Now she moved through Red Hollow on a Friday afternoon, and she felt the second level shifting beneath her feet. The note under the door had not come from nowhere. It had come from someone who was connected, who had resources, who knew where she was sleeping, which meant someone had been watching the house, which meant someone in this town was still actively working to protect Hatch's interests. She needed to know who. She stopped by May's at 3 o'clock after the laundry work was done for the day. May listened to everything Clara told her. The note, Calloway's assessment, the question of who in Red Hollow was still on Hatch's side. She listened without interrupting, which was a form of respect Clara recognized and returned. "Aldrich," May said when Clara finished. "That's what Calloway thinks too. It's not just what I think, it's what I know." May set down the cup she'd been holding. 3 weeks before Hatch was arrested, Aldrich came to my door. He wanted to commission extra laundry work linens, mostly a large order. He paid in advance. Cash. She paused. More cash than the order warranted. Clara went still. He was establishing a reason to have cash transactions with someone outside his usual circle. "That's what I decided he was doing," May said. "I took the money and did the laundry and kept my mouth shut because I have a business, and I do not involve myself in other people's arrangements." She looked at Clara directly. "But I kept the bill of transaction, dated and signed, in case." "In case of exactly this," Clara said. In case of exactly this, May agreed. I didn't know what I was keeping it for. I just knew that a man who overpays for laundry is a man who's cleaning something other than his sheets. Clara felt something that in a different life with different vocabulary she might have called joy. Not the bright, uncomplicated joy of easy circumstances, but the deep, specific joy of watching a careful person's careful preparation intersect with the exact moment it was needed. May, she said, I need to bring Deputy Marshal Calloway to you. I know you do, May said. That's why I'm telling you. Dot. Calloway sat in May Dugan's kitchen at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon and listened to May with the same complete attention he gave everything. And when May produced the bill of transaction from a tin box she kept behind the flour, he held it carefully, read it carefully, and set it on the table. This dates the payment to 6 days before Hatch's arrest, he said. It does, May said. Nated. Which means Aldrich had prior knowledge that the arrest was coming. He looked up. That means someone in the territorial marshal's office informed him. The room went quiet in a particular way. Hatch had more coverage than we knew, Clara said. He always had more coverage than we knew, Calloway said. That's how these things work. You pull one thread, and there are 3 more underneath. He looked at May. Mrs. Dugan, I need you to understand what this document means. It means you're a witness. It means your name goes on record. It means that whatever pressure has been applied to others may be applied to you. May Dugan looked at him with the unhurried directness of a woman who had been running her own business alone since her husband died 9 years ago and had not asked for help or sympathy or any particular consideration since. Deputy Marshal Calloway, she said. I've been in this town for 22 years. I've done laundry for every significant man in Red Hollow at one time or another. I know what's in their pockets by what I have to get out of their shirts. She folded her hands on the table. If this is the moment to say what I know, I would like to say it while it still does some good. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the bill of transaction with both hands, treating it like the evidence it was. Thank you, Mrs. Dugan, he said. Don't thank me, May said with a dry look at Clara. Somebody in this town needs to be worth something. And on Saturday morning, everything changed. Clara was at the house working through the accounts. She'd started keeping a record of every person she'd identified in her testimony, cross-referenced with what she knew of their connection to Hatch, the dates, the amounts where she remembered them. She was doing it because the information was in her head, and heads were mortal, and cases required paper, and nobody had asked her to do it, but it seemed like the kind of thing that ought to exist. She heard hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast toward the house. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. 3 riders, coming in from the East Road, moving at a pace that was not casual, not official, not the measured approach of men on legitimate business. Moving at the pace of men who had decided on a course of action and were past the point of reconsidering it. Calloway was in town. Ardent was at the marshal's office. She was alone. Clara stepped back from the window. She looked around the house with the rapid inventory of a woman who had been in difficult situations before and knew that the first thing you assessed was what you had. She had the back door. She had a clear line to the scrubland behind the property. She had her own 2 feet, and she had used them to get out of worse situations than this. She also had Calloway's spare rifle on the rack by the front door loaded, and the very specific knowledge that she had grown up on a Kentucky farm and had been shooting since she was 12. She made a different choice than the back door. She took the rifle off the rack. She stood to the side of the front window, not in front of it, but to the side where she could see out without being seen clearly, and she watched the 3 riders come to a stop in the yard. The man in front was not someone she recognized. He was broad with a duster much like Calloway's, but wearing it differently. Wearing it the way a man wears something borrowed from someone he's trying to imitate. He looked at the house with the calculating assessment of someone running numbers. "Anyone in there?" he called. Not a question. A statement designed to look like a question. Clara did not answer. "We're looking for the woman staying here," he called. "Got a message for her. From friends." The word friends arrived with a specific weight that had nothing friendly in it. Clara held the rifle and thought very clearly and very fast. 3 men. She could not handle 3 men with 1 shot. She could handle 1, and the other 2 would determine what happened next based on what they were willing to pay for their errand. The question was what they were willing to pay. She made a decision. She moved to the front door. She opened it, and she stood in the doorway with the rifle leveled not at any one of them specifically, but in a position that made the geometry clear to any man who understood geometry. "There's no message I want from Aldrich," she said. The name landed. She saw it land in the faces of all 3, the slight involuntary flinch of men who had not expected to have the name of their employer spoken aloud by the woman they'd come to intimidate. "Ma'am," the front man started. "I know what you were sent to do," Clara said. Her voice was level. Her hands were steady. 3 years of carrying glasses in a crowded room had given her hands a steadiness that went bone deep. "And I want you to think very carefully about whether Gerald Hatch's freedom is worth the risk you're currently calculating in your head." Silence. "Because I will tell you what I know," she said. "Deputy Marshal Calloway will be back at this house within the hour. Cole Ardent is at the marshal's office 2 minutes' ride from here, and my testimony is already on paper in Prescott at the territorial marshal's office, where it will exist whether or not I do." The front man looked at her. She looked back. "Commissioner Aldrich," she said, "is a frightened man who is trying to move pieces on a board that has already been decided. You are not pieces I need to take, but I will if you give me reason." Another silence. The desert kind, the thick, hot, consequential silence of a standoff being silently adjudicated. The front man pulled his horse back 1 step, then 2. He looked at the other 2, something communicated between them in the language of men recalculating odds. Then all 3 of them turned and rode back the way they'd come. Clara stood in the doorway until they were out of sight. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door and leaned against it and let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From the particular physical aftermath of having held herself completely still under pressure, the way a drawn bow shakes slightly when the arrow is finally released. She had not fired. She had not needed to. She had looked 3 men in the eye and said the name of the man who'd sent them, and she had been right about what they were willing to pay. She set the rifle back on the rack. She was still standing there when she heard hoofbeats again, 1 horse this time coming fast from the direction of town, and then Calloway was in the yard and through the door before she'd fully turned around. He stopped when he saw her, took in the room, took in her face. "Someone saw 3 riders headed this way and came for me," he said. His voice was controlled. His eyes were doing a fast assessment of the room of her checking for damage. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Clara." "I'm fine," she said again. "They're gone. I told them I knew who sent them and that my testimony was already in Prescott and that you'd be back within the hour." She paused. I may have implied the hour more confidently than I felt it. He looked at her for a long moment. The rifle was back on the rack, but she hadn't moved far from it, and he could read the geometry of the room the way she could read people. "You held them off," he said. "I held them off. With the rifle. It helped that I knew how to hold it like I'd use it." "Would you have used it?" She met his eyes. If they'd dismounted, she said yes. He stood there looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something past his usual precision. Something that had heat, and something heavier than heat in it. Something she had seen building in quiet increments across 5 days, and had been carefully not looking at directly. "You should have gone out the back," he said. His voice was different, lower. "Probably," she said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him. "Because I'm tired," she said, "of going out the back." The silence after that was the longest one they'd had. Longer than the one at Hannigan's, longer than the one at the kitchen table over the 3 cups. The kind of silence that isn't empty at all, but is so full it requires both people to hold it carefully, the way you carry something you're not yet ready to name. Calloway moved. Not toward her to the rifle. He checked it the way a man checks something precious that's been used well. Then he put it back on the rack. "Aldrich is going to make another move," he said. Back to business. Back to the work. But something had shifted between them. Something settled the way ground settles after it's been disturbed and finds its new level. "I know," Clara said. "We need to move faster than he does." "Then let's move faster." He looked at her, that almost smile. 6:30 tomorrow, he said. "I need you at the marshal's office with everything you have on Aldrich specifically. Every visit, every detail." "I'll be there at 6, she said. He held her gaze one moment longer than the work required. Then he nodded and picked up his hat and went back out to see to his horse. And Clara stood in the center of the room and let the day settle around her and thought about the 3 cups on the shelf and the note under the door and what it meant that she had stood in the doorway of this man's house with his rifle in her hands and felt for the first time in a very long time like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, the Arizona evening was coming down over everything, over the scrub and the dust and the mountains and the town below. Red Hollow, with all its watching and its judging and its closed doors, lay at the foot of everything she was now inside of, and she was no longer standing on its main street with a carpet bag and nowhere to go. She was standing on different ground, and for the first time since Tuesday, she felt the weight of it not as burden, as anchor. The Sunday morning after the 3 riders came and went, Red Hollow woke up with a different face. Clara felt it before she could name it. The way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, a pressure shift. Something in the quality of the air that tells you the situation has moved into a new phase. She felt it walking to May's Laundry at 6:20, felt it in the way people on the main street looked at her, and then looked away. Too quickly felt it in the particular silence that dropped around her as she passed 2 men talking outside the feed store who had been loud enough to hear half a block away. Something had been said about her, something specific, something that had moved through the town's 2nd level overnight and arrived at everyone's breakfast table before she'd had her first cup of coffee. She kept walking, head level, pace steady. May was already at the laundry and already knew. Clara could tell by the way May handed her the apron with a deliberateness that said she'd been waiting to hand it to her and was relieved she'd shown up to receive it. "What happened?" Clara said. Not a question. "Aldrich," May said. "He called a meeting last night. Private at his home, but in this town private means 12 people know by morning." She pulled a shirt from the wash basin. "He's saying you're not a credible witness. He's saying your testimony is the word of a saloon woman against the word of established citizens. He's using those words. Saloon woman." She said the phrase the way you'd handle something contaminated. "He's building the argument before the hearing." Clara tied the apron strings. "He's going to try to discredit me before I testify." "He's already trying." May looked at her. "There are people listening to him. Not everyone, but enough." "Who?" May named 4 names. 2 were men Clara had expected. 2 surprised her people she'd thought were neutral people who had nothing obvious to gain from Hatch's protection. She held the names in her mind and turned them over, looking for the connection she'd missed. "The Whitfield brothers," she said slowly. "They own the North Pasture land." "They do," May said, "and they bought it in 1884. The year landed. 1884. The same window as the fraudulent surveys. "They don't know," Clara said. "They're supporting Aldrich because they don't know their own deed might be fraudulent. They think they're protecting their property by keeping the investigation from going too deep." May stopped ringing. She looked at Clara with the expression of someone who has just watched a complicated thing become clear. "They're afraid the case will unsettle their land," May said. "Exactly. Aldrich is using that fear. He's not telling them their deed is at risk. He's telling them that an unstable investigation, a woman witness with a questionable background, is what puts their land at risk." Clara felt the shape of it clicking into alignment, the way a case did when you finally understood the mechanism. He's brilliant in a corrupt way. He's turned the victims into his defenders. May was quiet. Then she said, "Can that be fixed?" "If someone tells the Whitfield brothers the truth before the hearing," Clara said, If someone explains that their deed's validity depends on the investigation succeeding, not failing. She paused. If someone they trust tells them. May looked at her. I've done laundry for Tom Whitfield for 15 years. I know you have. May picked up the next shirt. I'll be at his place by 4 o'clock. Son, she told Calloway at noon. He listened to all of it. Aldrich's meeting the 4 names, the Whitfield connection. May's plan with the focused attention she'd learned to read as his highest form of respect. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was integrating rather than reacting. He's smarter than I gave him credit for, Calloway said. Most people are, Clara said, if you underestimate them. He looked up at her briefly, and something in his expression acknowledged that she was speaking from experience. The character attack complicates things. Not legally, your testimony stands on its own merits and the ledger corroborates it independently. But a jury is people, and people carry their social assumptions into the box with them. So we need to cut the legs out from under the social argument before it gets to the jury, Clara said, which means we need more witnesses, people who aren't saloon workers, people whose word Aldrich can't dismiss the same way. He leaned forward. The 53 landowners. How many of them does the town know and respect? All of them, Clara said. That's the point. These are working families, homesteaders, people who built something here. She held his gaze. If they stand up at the hearing and say Gerald Hatch stole their land, Aldrich can't call all of them saloon women. A silence. The hearing is in 11 days, Calloway said. Then we have 11 days. He studied her for a moment. This is going to require you to go to those families directly, to explain the deed situation to people who don't know it yet. Some of them are going to be frightened. Some of them are going to be angry. And some of that anger is going to land on you because you're the one telling them. I know that. Clara, I know that, she said again. I've been delivering difficult information to people my whole life. I know how to stand in the middle of someone else's fear and not take it personally. She met his eyes. Let me do this. He looked at her for a long time. In all the days she'd known him, he had never looked at her quite this way, with something that went past the case, past the professional precision, into something more personal and more careful. All right, he said. I'll start with the Harpers, she said. Today. I'll ride with you. You'll slow me down, she said not unkindly. They'll see a badge and they'll be frightened before I've said a word. Let me go first, alone. Give me until sunset. He didn't like it. She could see that clearly. The conflict between the work which said let her go and something else that didn't have an official designation. Sunset, he said. And if you're not back, I'll be back, she said. I'm always back. No. She visited 4 families that afternoon. The Harpers, first James and Ruth Harper, who had 3 children under 10 and a homestead they'd worked for 6 years and a fraudulent deed they had no idea was fraudulent. Ruth Harper cried. James Harper did not, but his face went through things that were harder to watch than tears. Clara sat at their kitchen table and told them the truth, and then told them what it meant, and then told them what they could do about it. Your land is not lost, she said. That's the thing I need you to understand first before anything else. The investigation is what protects your claim, not what threatens it. If Gerald Hatch goes free, the fraudulent deeds stand. If he's convicted, the territorial court will reissue clean title to every affected property. James Harper looked at her across the table. He was 40 years old and had the particular worn-down look of a man who had given everything to a piece of land and could not survive losing it. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Because I lived in this town for 3 years, Clara said, and I watched, and I know what was done to you, and I know what the truth is. And it seems to me that the truth is more useful than staying quiet. Ruth Harper reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. Clara sat very still. She was not accustomed to being touched with kindness. She had not been for a long time. What do we need to do? Ruth asked. Come to the hearing, Clara said. Bring anyone else you know who might be affected. The more voices there are, the harder it is for Aldrich to make this about one woman's word against the town's. She left the Harpers and went to the Dunleavys, and then to old Mr. Sorensen, and then to a family named Beale, who had 3 grown sons and a cattle operation that had been built on a deed that Elias Dean, dead since 1879, had supposedly surveyed in 1885. The Beale sons listened hard and said little, and at the end of the conversation, the oldest one, a man named Frank, who was built like a boulder and had the quiet of someone who'd learned that speaking too fast cost you, stood up and shook Clara's hand. "You need us at that hearing," he said. "We'll be there." "Bring your brothers," Clara said. "I'll bring every man who'll listen to me between here and the county line," Frank Beale said. "Reckon that's considerable." She was back at the house before sunset as promised. Calloway was already there. He had coffee on and was sitting at the table with paperwork. And when she came in, he looked up with the controlled relief of a man who'd been watching the door. "4 families," she said. "All of them will come. Frank Beale says he'll bring more." He looked at her. "How are you?" "I'm functional," she said. And then, because he'd asked it in a way that deserved honesty, Ruth Harper put her hand over mine at the kitchen table, and I had to concentrate very hard on not reacting to it. He was quiet for a moment. "When did people stop being kind to you?" "A long time ago," she said. "I stopped expecting it so I'd stop missing it." He poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her and sat back down across from her and didn't say anything else, because he understood she'd come to know this about him, that some things were better answered with presence than with words. They sat in the kitchen, and the Arizona evening settled around them, and she drank her coffee and let herself be tired just for an hour. Just there, just with him. She allowed herself that much. The town council met on Monday morning. Clara knew about it because May Dugan knew about it, and May Dugan knew about it because Tom Whitfield, who had listened to May the previous afternoon, and whose face had gone through the same things as James Harper's, and who had subsequently spent the evening talking to his brother, had sent word to May that morning that the council meeting had been called by Aldrich, and that it was not, as the official notice claimed, about road maintenance. It was about Ethan Calloway. She got to the marshal's office before Calloway left for it, arriving at a run that she converted to a fast walk 2 doors down so as not to arrive breathless. "The council meeting," she said before she'd fully come through the door. "It's about you." Calloway looked up from his desk. Ardent, who was there again, straightened. "Aldrich called it," she said. "He's going after your judgment, your authority. He's going to argue that you've compromised the investigation by—" She stopped. She made herself say it plainly because that was always better than circling it. "By having a relationship with a primary witness." The silence was brief and specific. "He means you're staying here," Calloway said. "Yes." "And he's going to frame that as impropriety." "Yes." Calloway set down his pen. His expression had not changed, that steadiness of his, that absolute refusal to be knocked sideways by incoming, but she could see something working behind it. Something cold and precise being assembled. "He's trying to remove you from the case," Ardent said. "If he can get the council to petition the territorial marshal's office, argue that the lead investigator has a conflict of interest. The case gets delayed," Calloway finished. "The hearing gets moved. Hatch's attorney gets the continuance he's been asking for." "And the families wait longer," Clara said. "And in the meantime, more pressure gets applied, more witnesses get frightened, more documentation gets moved." She looked at Calloway. "He's not wrong politically. He's not wrong about how this looks. He's just wrong about what it is." Calloway looked at her steadily for a moment. "What it is," he said, "is a man providing shelter to a witness who had nowhere to go. That is what it is. I'm willing to say so in front of the council." "That may not be enough," Ardent said. "Aldrich will push the impropriety angle regardless of the facts. He needs the cloud over the testimony, not an actual conviction of wrongdoing." "Then I need to not be staying here anymore," Clara said. Both men looked at her. If I'm at the house, Aldrich has his argument. If I'm somewhere else, somewhere public, somewhere that removes even the appearance of the thing he's trying to suggest, She thought fast. May Dugan. She has a spare room. She's already a witness herself. If I'm boarding with May Aldrich, loses the social angle. Calloway's jaw moved slightly. Clara. It's the right move, she said. You know it is. He looked at her. She looked back. The room was very quiet. It doesn't change the testimony, she said. It doesn't change the case. It just removes the weapon he's trying to use. Another silence. Longer this time. I'll talk to May, he said finally. I already know what she'll say, Clara said. I'll pack this afternoon. She was packed and at May's by 3 o'clock. The move was practical and correct, and she had made it with her eyes open, and she told herself firmly that the hollow feeling it left in the center of her chest was simply the loss of a situation she'd become accustomed to, and not anything more complicated than that. She told herself this several times. May showed her to the spare room and said nothing about why she'd needed it, which was another form of May's particular grace. The council meeting had happened while Clara was packing. Ardent told her about it that evening briefly and directly. Aldrich had made his case. The council had listened, and Calloway had walked in at the end and said in front of every member that Miss Clara Whitmore had moved to appropriate lodgings that morning, and that any suggestion of impropriety in the investigation was factually incorrect and would be treated as interference with the territorial marshal's inquiry. The council had gone quiet. Aldrich had pushed, and Calloway had looked at him across the table and said with the particular measured precision of a man who knows exactly how much weight his words carry. Commissioner Aldrich, I want to be very clear. Every action I take in this investigation is on record. Every action you have taken in relation to this investigation is also on record. I would encourage you to consider carefully which of us has more reason to want that record examined. Aldrich had said nothing else. Clara, hearing this from Ardent, felt something settle in her chest that was partly relief and partly something else, a warmth for this man and his absolute refusal to be less than he was, that she was finding increasingly difficult to categorize as purely professional. The twist came on Wednesday. It came in the form of a man named Porter Gill, who walked into the marshal's office at 9 in the morning and asked for Deputy Marshal Calloway, and when Calloway came out, handed him a sealed letter from the territorial marshal's office in Prescott. Clara was not in the office. She was at May's working through her written account of the Aldrich transactions when May came in from town at 10:30 with the look of a woman carrying news she hadn't sorted out what to do with yet. What? Clara said. Someone's been talking to the territorial marshal's office, May said. Over Calloway's head. Clara went still. Aldrich. Not Aldrich. May sat down. Judge Harlan Morse, the judge assigned to hear the case. The name arrived like cold water. Morse is one of the judges Calloway mentioned, Clara said slowly. One of Hatch's arrangements. He was, May said. He's removed himself from the case this morning. Voluntary recusal. He claims a conflict of interest he didn't previously disclose. He's protecting himself, Clara said. He's stepping back before the evidence gets to where his name appears. That's what I'd call it, May said. But the recusal means the case gets reassigned, new judge, out of Santa Fe. That could take 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3. 3 more weeks. 3 more weeks for Aldrich to work his angles for frightened witnesses to reconsider for the weight of a town's social pressure to wear down the people Clara had spent Sunday afternoon shoring up. 3 more weeks for Hatch's attorney to move to delay, to chip at the edges of a case that was solid but not yet closed. Clara sat with this for 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and kept writing. May watched her. You're not going to stop. 3 weeks is 3 weeks, Clara said. It's also time to build things stronger. She kept writing. I need every name in that ledger cross-referenced with every piece of physical evidence Calloway has. I need to know exactly which of Aldrich's moves we can cut off before he makes them. She looked up. And I need to talk to Frank Beale. About what? About the fact that Tom Whitfield and his brother and every other affected landowner now has 3 more weeks to get organized, Clara said. And organized landowners are harder to ignore than frightened ones. She was at Calloway's office by noon. He was already working the same problem from his angle, the new judge's timeline. The implications of Morse's recusal, the possibility that Morse's sudden conscience was itself a strategic move designed to look cooperative while buying time. He looked up when she came in, and she could see the mourning on him. "Morse," she said. "Morse," he confirmed. "He's on the ledger. Page 12, quarterly payments 1884 through 1886. They stopped in 86, which is probably when he started getting nervous and asked Hatch to clean up his entry." His jaw was tight. The entry's still there. Hatch wasn't the kind of man to give up leverage. So Morse recused himself to create distance before the ledger becomes public record, Clara said. He's going to claim he had no recent involvement, that any prior arrangement was a private business matter, that the recusal itself proves his good faith. That's exactly what he's going to claim, Calloway said. And without a direct witness to any transaction between Morse and Hatch, the ledger entry alone may not be sufficient for criminal charges against him specifically. Clara crossed to the desk. She put her hands flat on the surface and looked at him directly. "I heard Morse's name," she said. "Once, in the back of the Golden Spur. I told you that in the first testimony session." "You heard it once, you said." "In passing. I heard it clearly. I was collecting glasses from the back table when Hatch was ending a meeting with Rourke. Rourke said, and I can give you his exact words, 'Morse wants the quarterly increased. He says the risk has gone up.' And Hatch said, 'Tell Harlan he'll get what he earns same as always.' Then they both went quiet, because they heard me." She held Calloway's gaze. "I kept my face entirely neutral and took my glasses and left. I have never told anyone that until this moment." The room was very still. "You've been holding that," he said. "I've been holding it until it was the right time to use it," she said. "It's the right time." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Tell me every word, exactly as you remember them." The week that followed moved at two speeds simultaneously: the grinding slow of official delay and the rapid pressurized speed of people working hard beneath it. Clara wrote and revised her formal testimony with Ardent every morning. She visited 2 more families in the afternoons. May talked to Tom Whitfield, who talked to his brother, who talked to Frank Beale, who had apparently been as good as his word about the county line by Thursday. Calloway had received informal word that 14 additional landowners were prepared to appear at the hearing, and that Frank Beale had organized them with an efficiency that Ardent described as almost military. "Farmer logic," Clara told Ardent. "When your land is threatened, you move fast and you move together. It's the same instinct." On Friday, Calloway came to May's in the evening to review the week's developments. May put out food and then found reasons to be elsewhere with the tact of a woman who understood the architecture of other people's situations. They sat at May's kitchen table, which was different from Calloway's kitchen table, and Clara felt the difference. Felt the way the move had created a gap she'd told herself was practical and correct, and felt sitting across from him in someone else's kitchen more like loss than logic. He felt it too. She could tell. Not from anything he said. From the way he sat slightly more formally than he sat at his own table, the way you hold yourself in someone else's space. 11 witnesses, he said, including the 4 families you visited. The Beale contingent, May, and Rourke, who has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. "Rourke will be the most powerful witness," Clara said. "A man who participated in the scheme testifying against it is harder for Aldrich to dismiss than I am." "You are not easy to dismiss," Calloway said. "Aldrich is trying. Aldrich is going to fail." He said it without heat, which made it more convincing than if he'd said it with anger. He said it the way you state a calculation you've already completed. She looked at him across May's table. "Calloway," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said carefully. "When the hearing is done, and the case is closed, and you move to the next one, the 13th. She paused. "Where will that be?" He held her gaze. "I don't know yet," he said, "but somewhere. That's been the pattern." She nodded. She looked at the table. She had started this conversation because she needed to understand the shape of what she was allowing herself to feel, and she had already understood it well enough that she wasn't certain she needed to finish asking. "Clara?" His voice. She looked up. "I said that's been the pattern," he said. "I didn't say it was fixed." The silence after that was enormous. It was the silence of two people looking at something neither of them had named yet, standing at the edge of it, feeling the pull. She did not look away. He did not look away. And then May's back door opened, and May came in with a load of folded laundry, and the moment folded itself up and placed itself carefully to the side, where it remained present and patient, waiting. The attack came on Saturday morning. Not 3 riders this time. Something worse than that. Clara was walking from May's to the Mercantile at 8 o'clock, moving through the main street as she always did. Head-level pace, steady route, varied as Calloway had asked. She was thinking about the new judge's timeline about Arden's update the previous day, about the specific wording of the Morse testimony she'd given on Thursday. She heard it before she fully processed it. A woman's voice. Loud, deliberate. "There she is, the saloon girl who got the marshal wrapped around her finger." Clara stopped walking. She turned. It was Margaret Aldrich, the commissioner's wife, standing outside the millinery with 2 other women. Women Clara recognized, women whose husbands she had served at the Golden Spur for 3 years. She was 45 years old and had the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now set in the particular hardness of a woman whose power was entirely borrowed from her husband's position and who was therefore very careful about protecting it. "That's not a conversation I'm interested in having, Mrs. Aldrich," Clara said. Her voice was level. She kept it level. "I'm not asking if you're interested." Margaret Aldrich stepped forward. She was in full public view in the middle of Red Hollow's main street on a Saturday morning when the town was out and moving. This was not an accident. "I'm telling you that decent women in this town know what you are and what you're doing. Hiding behind a federal badge doesn't change where you came from." "Where I came from," Clara said, "is not your business. You made it everyone's business when you moved yourself into a lawman's house and decided your word was worth something." The woman's voice was carrying, and it was meant to carry, and people were stopping on the boardwalk, pulling up the way crowds do when they sense spectacle. "Your word is worth exactly what it's always been worth. Nothing." Clara stood in the middle of the street. She had 2 choices. She had always had exactly 2 choices in situations like this: retreat or hold. She had retreated before. She had retreated from more dangerous things than Margaret Aldrich on a Saturday morning. Retreat was sometimes the right call, the practical call, the call that lived to fight again. She thought about Ruth Harper's hand over hers at the kitchen table. She thought about Frank Beale saying she'd need them at the hearing, and he'd bring every man who'd listen to him between there and the county line. She thought about May Dugan handing her an apron at 6:25. She thought about Ethan Calloway saying, "I didn't say it was fixed." She did not retreat. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said clearly and steadily, in a voice that carried as well as the other woman's had, "your husband is afraid. He's afraid because he knows what the ledger says, because he knows what the witnesses will say, and because he knows that the only thing standing between him and the territorial court is the question of whether this town believes a woman who worked in a saloon." She paused. "He sent you here this morning, to this street in front of these people, to answer that question for them before they can answer it for themselves." Silence on the boardwalk. "I've watched that happen to people my whole life," Clara said. "The way people in power use the people who love them to carry their fear out in public so they don't have to carry it themselves." She looked at Margaret Aldrich steadily. "I'm not angry at you. I know why you're standing here. I know who sent you." Something moved in Margaret Aldrich's face. Something that wasn't anger. Something more fragile than anger. "My testimony is in Prescott," Clara said. "It is on record. It is corroborated by documents that existed before I ever opened my mouth. You can call me every name your husband gave you to use, and it won't change a single word of it." She held the woman's gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and kept walking to the mercantile. She heard nothing behind her, no continuation, no escalation. Just the sound of Red Hollow processing what it had just witnessed. She was halfway to the mercantile when she heard footsteps behind her, and she had one sharp second of pure physical alertness before she recognized the gait May Dugan moving fast for a woman of her years. May came up beside her and matched her pace and said nothing for half a block. "You didn't shake," May said finally. "I was shaking on the inside," Clara said. "Long as it stays on the inside," May said. They walked together to the mercantile. May bought flour she probably didn't need. Clara bought salt and didn't say much. When they came out, the boardwalk where Margaret Aldrich had been standing was empty. Calloway found out within the hour. In a town this size, everything found him within the hour. He came to May's in the afternoon, and he came in with that compressed energy again. But this time it was different. Not the urgency of a man working a case, but the urgency of a man who has heard something happen to a person he cares about and has not yet confirmed that she is intact. He came through the door, and he looked at Clara, and she looked back at him, and everything in his face went slightly easier. "I heard," he said. "I know you did. Are you all right?" "I'm whole," she said. Which was different from fine, and he heard the difference. He stood in May's front room, and he looked at her with something that had moved considerably past professional over the course of 12 days and was now just itself. What it was. Unnamed, but present, and neither of them pretending otherwise. "She was trying to break you in public," he said. "I know. And you held." "I held." He was quiet. Then he said in a voice that was very controlled and very deliberate, and therefore very clear, "I went to the council this afternoon, after I heard. I told them in front of every member, including Aldrich himself, that the witness tampering the writers the note this morning had been logged as formal interference with a federal investigation. I told them that Commissioner Aldrich's name appears multiple times in the evidence, and that any further action directed at any witness in this case would be treated as obstruction and prosecuted as such." Clara looked at him. "You said that in front of Aldrich?" "Directly to him, by name." "How did he respond?" Calloway's jaw shifted slightly. "He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I told him that was fine, and that I looked forward to discussing everything he didn't know about at the hearing." Something opened in Clara's chest, wide and warm and dangerous. "Calloway," she said. "Ethan," he said. She looked at him. "We've been in the same house," he said. "We've been through all of this. You can call me Ethan." She let the name sit in her mouth for a moment, the weight of it, the intimacy of something as simple as a first name. "Ethan," she said. He stood there with his hat in his hands and looked at her. Outside Red Hollow went on turning, and somewhere inside Aldrich's house, a frightened man was making new calculations. And in Prescott, a new judge was reviewing a case file that was growing stronger with every day. And 11 witnesses, now 12, now 15, now the Beale contingent, and the Harper family, and old Mr. Sorensen, who had saved 20 years for his land, were holding themselves in readiness. And inside May Dugan's front room, 2 people stood in the particular truth of what they had become to each other over 12 days in the Arizona summer, and neither of them looked away. 3 more days to the hearing, Clara said. 3 more days, he said. Then we'll see what Red Hollow is made of. We already know what Red Hollow is made of, he said. He held her gaze. We also know what you're made of. That's the part that matters. She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. The answer was in the room, in the air between them, in every steady moment since Tuesday when the carpetbag hit the dirt and a man rode in from the north and looked at her in a way that saw her. It was all in that room. And Red Hollow had 3 more days to decide what it was going to do about it. The 3 days before the hearing did not pass quietly. Nothing in Red Hollow passed quietly anymore. Not since Calloway had stood in front of the town council and said Aldrich's name out loud, with the full weight of a federal investigation behind it. Not since Clara had stood in the middle of the main street and held Margaret Aldrich's gaze until the other woman had nothing left to say. The town had shifted on its axis, the way towns do. When the thing everyone has been pretending isn't true gets said plainly in public. And now it was moving and moving, things make noise. On the first of the 3 days, Arthur Rourke's attorney sent a letter to Ardent confirming his client's full cooperation and providing 3 additional names that had not appeared in Calloway's investigation before. One of them was a clerk in the Territorial Land Records office in Prescott, who had been altering the master survey records, not just the local copies, the master records for 6 years. The scope of the fraud expanded again, the way it kept expanding every time they thought they had its full shape, like something that had grown in the dark much longer than anyone had realized. Calloway told Clara that evening. She was at May's writing because she was always writing now. The physical act of putting the testimony on paper had become a kind of discipline, a way of holding the case together in her own mind, of making sure nothing slipped through the gaps her memory had preserved, but that memory alone couldn't prove. The Prescott clerk, she said. What's his name? Aldous Kern. She looked up. Kern. She was reaching back, pulling something from 3 years of accumulated detail. There was a letter. On Hatch's desk I saw it once open, not meaning to see it. It was signed with the initial K, and it referenced a correction to survey coordinates on a parcel in the North Valley. She put her pen down. I didn't know what I was reading at the time. I thought it was ordinary business correspondence. Calloway looked at her steadily. The North Valley parcel is Lot 41. It's one of the 53 fraudulent transactions. The survey was filed under Dean's forged name, but the coordinates were wrong. The original filing put the boundary line across a creek that didn't match the physical land. Someone corrected it afterward, quietly, without creating a new survey record. Kern corrected it, Clara said, to make it look legitimate, to make it look like an innocent clerical correction rather than evidence of tampering. He was on his feet now, moving the way he moved, when something was connecting that he'd been reaching for. If you saw that letter, I can't prove what it said, she said quickly, because she understood the legal architecture of this. I saw it for 10 seconds. I wasn't supposed to see it. I can't produce it, but I can describe it accurately enough that when Kern's records are examined, an investigator who knows what they're looking for will find the trail. The signature, Calloway said. You said it was signed with a K. Stylized. The K had a particular loop on the lower stroke, the kind of habit people don't know they have. She picked up her pen and sketched it on the edge of her paper, handed it to him. He looked at it. His expression shifted. He crossed to the desk and pulled out a folder. Inside it was a Land Office Form Standard Issue filed by Kern's office. He turned it so she could see the signature at the bottom. The loop on the lower stroke of the K was identical. The room was very still. That's him, Clara said. That's him, Calloway confirmed. She looked at the matching signatures and felt the case settle into its final shape, the way a load-bearing wall settles when everything around it has found its proper place. It was solid. It was complete. Every thread they had pulled had led somewhere, and every somewhere had led to the next, and now the whole terrible architecture of what Hatch had built was visible from foundation to roof. We have everything, she said. We have everything, he said. Then the hearing is going to go the way it needs to go. He looked at her across May's kitchen table. Yes, he said. It is. On the second day, the new judge arrived. His name was Samuel Carver, and he came up from Santa Fe on the early stage, and he was 60 years old, and built like a man who had been hearing difficult things for decades, and had developed the particular density of character that comes from refusing to be moved by anything except evidence. He had a gray beard and steady eyes, and he shook Calloway's hand with the directness of a man who had read the case file on the road and formed his preliminary opinion already. Clara was not at the meeting between Carver and Calloway. She was at the marshal's office waiting room, and she knew the judge had arrived because Ardent came out and told her, and she knew the preliminary meeting had gone well because of how Ardent's face looked when he came back out 40 minutes later. He wants to speak with you, Ardent said. She went in. Judge Carver looked at her the way she had learned over 12 days to recognize as the look of a man taking an accurate reading, not judging in the social sense, but assessing in the professional sense, measuring what she was against, what the case needed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've read your formal testimony. I have several questions." "Yes, sir," she said. She sat down across from him, and she put her hands on the table, and she was as steady as she had ever been in her life. He asked her questions for 90 minutes. He asked about the private ledger, about Rourke, about Aldrich, about the letter with the case signature, about the boot-heel water stain on the ledger's cover, about the specific words she'd heard in the back office when Hatch was speaking to Rourke about Morse. He asked everything Ardent had asked, and several things nobody had asked yet, and every question was a test, and every answer she gave him was the truth, and she did not drift. When he was done, he looked at her for a moment. "You've retained a considerable amount of specific detail," he said, "over a considerable period of time." "I do," she said. "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because I grew up understanding that the people with power in any room were not going to look after my interests. So I paid attention to theirs, in case I ever needed it." She paused. "I didn't know this was the need, but I kept the information anyway." Judge Carver studied her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "in 30 years on the bench, I have heard testimony from generals and senators and men who would consider themselves your considerable superior in every social category." He let that sit for a moment. "Your testimony is among the most precise and coherent I have encountered. I want you to know that before tomorrow." Clara kept her face composed. She kept it composed with everything she had. "Thank you, Judge," she said. She walked out of the room and down the corridor and out the front door of the marshal's office, and she stood in the Arizona afternoon heat, and she breathed. She breathed for a long time. On the third day, the day before the hearing, Aldrich made his final move. It came through a lawyer. A man named Cresswell, who had ridden in from Tucson, clearly expensive. Clearly retained for this purpose, specifically, who filed a motion at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with Judge Carver requesting a continuance on grounds that key witnesses had been coached by the investigating marshal, that the testimony had been shaped by a relationship between the marshal and the primary witness, and that due process required additional time to examine those allegations. Clara heard about it at 5 o'clock from Ardent, who was furious in the controlled way of a professional man whose professionalism is being professionally undermined. She went to find Calloway. He was at the marshal's office, standing at the window, holding Cresswell's motion in one hand. He had the look of a man who had known this move was coming and had prepared for it, and was angry anyway, because knowing something doesn't mean the arrival of it doesn't cost you something. "He's filing it because he's out of options," Clara said. "I know that. And Carver won't grant it. I know that too." He turned from the window. "But the allegation goes on record. That's what Aldrich wants. He can't stop the hearing. He can't suppress the evidence. So he puts the allegation on record, and when Hatch is convicted, and he will be convicted, Aldrich uses that record to argue the conviction was tainted, that the appeal has grounds. How long does an appeal take? 2 years minimum. 3 if the attorney is skilled." His voice was flat. "And in the meantime, the fraudulent deeds remain in limbo. The families can't sell, can't borrow against, can't fully settle their claims." Clara stood in the middle of the marshal's office and thought. The families, the Harpers, the Dunleavys, Mr. Sorensen, Frank Beale and his brothers. 2 years of their land held in limbo by an appeal built on an allegation about her and Calloway that was strategically constructed and fundamentally dishonest. She thought about that for 30 seconds. Then she said, "I need to speak with Judge Carver." Calloway looked at her. "About what?" "About removing the allegation's foundation," she said. "Aldrich's motion argues that my testimony was shaped by a relationship with the investigating marshal. If I address that directly in front of Carver on record before the hearing, the allegation has no surface to attach to." "Clara, you don't have to. What is it that you actually think I'm worried about saying?" she asked him. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "I've been honest about everything else. I'm not going to hide from this one because it's harder than the others." She held his gaze. "Let me talk to Carver." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, something that was not about the case at all, that was past all of it, that was about the woman standing in front of him who had been honest about everything from the first hour and was still standing. "I'll arrange it," he said.
Chateau.
She sat down with Judge Carver at 6:30 that evening. Alone, Calloway was not in the room because that was the point. "Your Honor," she said, "I want to address the Cresswell motion directly and on record." Carver had his pen ready. "Go ahead, Miss Whitmore. I have been staying at Deputy Marshal Calloway's house. That is accurate. I moved from that arrangement to May Duggan's boarding room several days ago, also accurate. The circumstance of the original lodging was this. I was dismissed from my employment without pay. When the Golden Spur was closed, I was denied employment by multiple Red Hollow businesses in the days following, and I had 2 weeks of funds remaining. Deputy Marshal Calloway offered a spare room on practical grounds, and I accepted it on practical grounds. Nothing occurred in that house that influenced my testimony in any direction." She met the judge's eyes. "My testimony is accurate not because of Marshal Calloway, but despite everything in Red Hollow that has tried to make it otherwise." Carver wrote. He wrote for a while. "The motion also alleges," he said carefully, "that the relationship between yourself and the deputy marshal has an improper character." Clara did not look away. "Deputy Marshal Calloway is a man of complete integrity," she said. "What exists between us personally is nothing I am ashamed of and nothing that has compromised a single word of my testimony. I respect him. He respects me. In Red Hollow, Arizona Territory in 1887, that is apparently sufficient to constitute a scandal." She paused. "It is not sufficient to constitute a legal problem." Carver looked at her over his pen. "No," he said. "It is not." He wrote something at the bottom of the page, signed it, and set the pen down. "I'll deny the continuance motion in the morning," he said. "The hearing begins at 10 o'clock. "Thank you, Judge." She walked out. She told herself not to feel the weight of what she'd just said out loud. What exists between us personally told herself it was a legal statement, a practical statement, a thing that needed to be said on record for the sake of the families and the deeds and the hearing. She told herself that. She mostly believed it. The morning of the hearing, Red Hollow turned out. Clara had not expected the numbers. She had hoped for 12 witnesses, had planned for 15 with the Beale contingent. What arrived at the territorial court, a room attached to the courthouse with a cracked front step that she had walked past 100 times, was closer to 40 people. 40 people from Red Hollow and the surrounding county. Homesteaders and ranchers and farmers and their wives. People who had built things on land that someone had tried to steal from them, who had come to say so publicly in front of a judge from Santa Fe, who had no connection to Gerald Hatch's arrangement. Frank Beale was in the second row with all 3 of his brothers. Tom Whitfield and his brother were there. The Harpers. James in his good coat, Ruth with her hands folded steady. Mr. Sorensen in his Sunday clothes, 80 years old and upright. May Dugan near the back present, and deliberate the way she was present at everything that mattered. Clara sat at the front table with Ardent. She did not look for Calloway immediately. She arranged her papers, and she breathed, and she held herself the way she had always held herself when the thing that needed doing was hard. Then she looked. He was standing at the side of the room, not at the table the case was Ardent's to present, and Calloway had understood without being told that his presence at the primary table would be the thing Cresswell would lean on. He stood at the side in his duster and his weathered hat, and he looked across the room at her. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her papers. She was ready. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Ardent presented the evidence methodically and without theater. The 2 ledgers, the forged surveys under Dean's dead name, the documented payments, the land office records, the testimony of Rourke. Clara testified for 68 minutes. She did not drift. She did not qualify or second guess. She answered every question Arden asked, and every question Cresswell tried to use to pull her off her footing. And when Cresswell suggested delicately that her perspective might be shaped by personal interest, she looked at him calmly and said, "My testimony is corroborated by documents that existed before I ever spoke to anyone in this case. If you'd like to argue with the documents, they're on the table in front of you." The room did not laugh. But something moved through it, a collective recognition, a shift in weight. Cresswell moved on. The Whitfield brothers testified about their deed and the date they'd bought their land. Frank Beale testified about his and then spoke on behalf of 7 families who had given him their statements in writing when they couldn't make the journey. James Harper testified, and his voice cracked once, just once, when he described what the land meant to him and what it would mean to lose it. He got through it. Ruth Harper put her hand on his arm when he sat back down. The twist came at 3 hours and 12 minutes into the hearing, and it came in a form nobody had predicted. Cresswell stood up and asked to make a statement on behalf of his client. Carver allowed it. And Cresswell said in a voice that had lost most of its earlier confidence, his client wished to enter a modified plea. The room went completely silent. Gerald Hatch, brought in from Prescott in custody and seated at the defendant's table in a suit that had been pressed wrong, looked across the courtroom at the 40 people who had come to testify against him at the ledger, open on the evidence table at Clara Whitmore, sitting straight-backed and unbroken in the witness chair. And he entered a plea of guilty to 22 of the 36 charges, not all of them. Hatch's attorney had negotiated. But 22 charges, including the core land fraud, counts the bribery of county officials and the falsification of public records. Cresswell had made the calculation that 40 witnesses and an unchallenged ledger were more than a conviction. They were a certain and comprehensive destruction, and a negotiated plea was the only way to preserve any part of his client's situation. Hatch looked at Clara once across the courtroom. Just once. She looked back. She did not look away first. Judge Carver sentenced Gerald Hatch to 16 years in territorial prison. Commissioner Aldrich was arrested in the courthouse hallway by Calloway himself 3 minutes after the sentence was read. The warrant had been prepared that morning. Aldrich went pale and then red and said something about his position, his family, his years of service. And Calloway listened to all of it with complete patience and then said, "You have the right to an attorney commissioner. I'd suggest you use it and put him in custody without another word." Rourke received 3 years with the possibility of reduced sentence for his cooperation. Aldous Kern in Prescott was taken into custody the same afternoon by deputy marshals acting on the warrant Calloway had filed the previous day. Judge Harlan Morse, the recused judge, was formally referred for investigation on the same afternoon. He would not escape the ledger. Nobody named in it would. It was done. Clara sat in the courthouse room for a while after it emptied. Not because she couldn't move, because she needed a moment, a private moment between herself and the fact of what had happened, what they had built from a carpetbag hitting the dirt, and a man riding in from the north, and 3 years of watching everything that nobody thought she was watching. 53 fraudulent land transactions. 26 families, eventually all 53. When the Prescott records were fully investigated, who would receive clean title to their land? A scheme that had been running since 1882, fed by corruption at every level, from the local sheriff to the territorial judiciary, dismantled in 4 hours in a room with a cracked front step. She thought about Ruth Harper's hand over hers. She thought about May Dugan handing her an apron. She thought about Frank Beale shaking her hand and saying, "Reckon that's considerable." She thought about a night in a spare room looking at mountains she'd never seen from that angle before, deciding that was not nothing. She was still sitting there when Calloway came back in. He came in quietly, the way he always came in, and he sat down in the chair across from her, which was what he always did. And for a while, neither of them said anything. That was fine. They had never needed to fill silence with noise. "It's done," she said finally. "It's done," he confirmed. Aldrich. In custody. Ardent's processing the paperwork. The families. Ardent will start the title reissuance process next week. It'll take time to work through all 53, but the legal foundation is clean now. Nobody loses their land." She nodded. She looked at the empty room around them. The chairs pushed back, the evidence table still set up, the light coming in through the single window at an angle that said it was late afternoon. "Carver offered me a commendation," Calloway said. She looked at him. "In the official case report," he said, "for the conduct of the investigation, for the standard of evidence built." He paused. "I told him if the commendation was accurate, it should name the witness who built the core of the case." She looked at him for a moment. "You didn't do that." "I did." "Calloway. Ethan. Ethan." She said it, and felt the same thing she'd felt the first time, that particular weight and warmth. "You didn't have to do that." "I've never done anything in my life," he said, "because I had to." The room was very quiet. She looked at him across the table in the empty courthouse. This man who had ridden in from the north on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at her without appetite or dismissal, who had offered a spare room because it seemed like the right thing, who had said her name like it had always belonged in his mouth, who had stood in front of the town council and said Aldrich's name out loud and said she was worth standing beside. "What happens now?" she said. He held her gaze. "Ardent closes out the paperwork. I filed the final case report to Prescott. The investigation is officially concluded." He paused. "And then I'm free." "Free," she said. "No case, no next station yet." He put his hat on the table. "For the first time in 6 years, I have nothing that tells me where to go next." The silence stretched between them, full and careful and entirely intentional. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the land on the north side, past the house. There's a parcel about a mile up that's been empty since I've been here. Good ground. Higher elevation, catches the morning air before the heat comes in." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I've been thinking, a man could build something there. If he had a reason." Clara did not look away. "That's a considerable statement," she said. "I've been told I don't waste words." She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the man who had seen her accurately from the first moment, who had asked what her plans were, and accepted the honest answer, who had sat across from her at a kitchen table and let the silence be what it was, without filling it with things that weren't true. She thought about the carpet bag in the dirt. She thought about New Mexico and Missouri and the Kentucky farm. She thought about every back door she had gone out of and every main street she had walked through, with her head level and her pace steady and her jaw set and her hands full of nothing but herself. She thought about what it felt like to stand in a doorway with a rifle in her hands and feel for the first time in a very long time like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I'm not a woman," she said carefully, "who needs someone to build a life for her." "I know that," he said. "I'm not proposing to build one for you. I'm saying I'd like to build one next to you, if you're willing to build at all." She was quiet. "I haven't stayed anywhere in a long time," she said. "Neither have I." "I don't know how to do this easily," she said. "I don't know how to be easy about it." "I'm not asking for easy," he said. "I'm asking for real." The word real arrived in the room and settled there, and it was the rightest word she had heard in longer than she could remember. Not perfect, not promised. Not the sugar-coated version that life kept offering and then taking back. Real, solid, built on actual ground. She thought about 3 cups on a shelf. "You bought 3 cups," she said, "because they came that way at the mercantile." He looked at her. "No," he said. He had said it before. He said it again now, and this time neither of them pretended it was about cups. "Then," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected it to be, "I suppose I'd like to see the north parcel." Something moved in his face, that near smile she had been watching build toward a real one for 15 days. And this time it arrived fully, entirely, without reservation. It was a good smile. It was the kind of smile a person put away carefully over years of hard work and got out only when the situation had genuinely earned it. "Tomorrow morning," he said. 6:30? 6, she said. May Dugan was on her front step when Clara walked back through Red Hollow that evening. May looked at her and read her face the way May read everything accurately, efficiently, without comment. "Well," May said. "Well," Clara said. "Hatch is in custody. 16 years. Aldrich. Taken in the hallway." May nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "And Calloway?" Clara looked at her. May looked back. "He wants to show me a parcel on the north side," Clara said. May's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did, something warm and dry and entirely May. "Good ground up there," May said. "Morning air comes in clean before the heat." Clara looked at her. "You know that land." "I know all the land around here," May said. "I've been here 22 years. She stood up from the step. "Come inside. I've got supper on." Clara followed her in, and May fed her, and they sat together at the kitchen table and talked about practical things. The title reissuance process. The Whitfield brothers. What Frank Beale had said on his way out of the courthouse, which was apparently unprintable, but enthusiastic. They talked about what it meant for the town, which accusations had already quietly collapsed, now that Aldrich was in custody, which people had been on the wrong side, and knew it, and were adjusting their positioning accordingly, with the universal human speed of people realigning after an outcome. They did not talk about the North Parcel, or about 6:30, or about 3 cups. But May, when Clara stood to clear the plates, put her hand briefly on Clara's arm. Just briefly. Just that. Clara stood still for a moment under the weight of it. "You did a good thing," May said. "Not just the testimony. All of it. The way you did it." Clara looked at her. "You did a good thing too," she said. "The bill of transaction. Keeping it." "I keep things," May said. "It's a habit." "It's a good habit," Clara said. May took the plates. "Go to bed," she said. "You've got a 6 o'clock to keep." She went to bed. She lay in the spare room at May's, and she looked at the ceiling, and she let the day be real. Hatch's guilty plea, the room full of 40 people, Carver's sentence. Calloway's face when she'd looked at him for 3 seconds across the courtroom and found him steady and present and entirely himself. The conversation in the empty courthouse, the smile she had waited 15 days to see complete. She let it all be real without diminishing it into practicality or inflating it into something it wasn't yet. It was what it was. A man and a woman who had built something real in 15 days in the Arizona summer, in the middle of a case that had no business producing anything except justice, and had produced that too. Real, solid, built on actual ground. She thought about the North Parcel, higher elevation, morning air coming in clean before the heat. She thought about staying somewhere for the first time, not because she had no choice, but because she had chosen. She thought about how different that felt, how it sat in the chest differently, that kind of staying. Heavy in a good way, weighted the way things are weighted when they matter. Outside Red Hollow was quiet. The courthouse was empty now. The evidence table cleared, the chairs pushed back. Gerald Hatch was on his way to a territorial prison cell, where he would stay for 16 years. The families who had come from the surrounding county were going home to their land, their actual land, their clean, deeded, legitimately owned land, and some of them wouldn't fully understand until the reissuance papers arrived what had been given back to them. And Clara Whitmore was lying in a borrowed room in a town that had closed every door on her 15 days ago, and tomorrow morning she was going to walk north with a man who had never once looked at her like she was furniture, and she was going to look at a piece of ground that caught the morning air before the heat came in. She was going to look at it and see what she thought. That was enough. That was everything. In Red Hollow, in the summer of 1887, a woman who had come from nothing and survived everything and kept 3 years of truth in the most reliable archive available herself, had walked through every door this town tried to close and built a case and stood in the open and chosen to stay. Not because she had nowhere left to go, but because she had finally found somewhere worth going to.